Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a deep dive into all sorts of fascinating topics.
That's right.
And if you're new here, make sure to hit that subscribe button so you don't miss out on future episodes. We're all about exploring new ideas and expanding our knowledge, together. And for even more brain-boosting content, be sure to check out our blog
Yeah.
at www.contextenglish.education. You'll find tons of resources and articles there to keep those synapses firing.
We're firm believers that learning should be an enjoyable journey.
Absolutely.
Every deep dive is a chance to discover something new and gain valuable insights.
Today we're tackling a topic that's crucial for anyone with a website,
Oh, yeah.
website speed. Now you might think this is just a technical issue, but it's actually about so much more than just how fast your pages load.
It's about creating a seamless and enjoyable experience for your visitors. And in today's digital world where attention spans are shorter than ever, every millisecond counts.
Absolutely. And did you know that nearly half of all internet users expect a page to load in 2 seconds or less? And a whopping 40% will abandon a website if it takes more than 3 seconds. That's a lot of potential customers or readers you could be losing if your site is sluggish.
Yeah, those numbers are startling, aren't they? It really highlights how important website speed is in today's competitive online landscape.
It's like the digital equivalent of walking into a shop and having to wait ages for someone to even acknowledge you. You'd probably just walk out and go to a different shop.
Exactly. So to help you avoid losing those valuable visitors, we're going to break down some proven strategies for speeding up your website.
And here's the thing. We're not just going to throw a random list of tips at you. We've organized these optimization techniques
Yeah.
based on their impact, high, medium, and low, and how difficult they are to implement.
We want to empower you to make strategic decisions about where to focus your efforts so you can get the biggest bang for your buck, so to speak.
I like that. Website speed optimization on a budget.
Well, yeah.
So where do we begin?
Let's start with something that's often overlooked, but can have a huge GE impact. Updating your PHP. Think of PHP as the engine of your website.
Okay, I'm following. So just like you'd want to keep your car's engine running smoothly, we need to make sure our website's PHP is up to date.
Precisely. And the great thing is, updating your PHP can often lead to dramatic improvements in speed. Imagine getting, say, a 50% performance boost just by making this one change.
Wow, that's significant. I'm already starting to see how those small tweaks can make a big difference.
They absolutely can. Now, this next one might hit a little closer to home for some listeners, especially if you're not particularly tech-savvy. We're talking about hosting, where your website lives on the internet.
Hosting. I've heard it's important, but I've always been a bit intimidated by the technical aspects.
I understand, but here's the key takeaway. Your hosting provider plays a much bigger role in your website's speed than you might realize.
So even if I optimize everything else perfectly, if my hosting server is slow, my website will still suffer.
It's like trying to win a race in a car with flat tires. No matter how skilled you are as a driver, you're going to be held back.
That's a great analogy. I never thought about it that way. So what should I be looking for in a hosting provider? What makes a host fast?
That's a great question, and one we could probably spend an entire deep dive discussing. But for now, let's just say that you want to look for a host that uses modern server technology, has a good reputation for speed and reliability, and offers features like caching and CDNs, which we'll talk about more later.
Okay, so hosting is definitely something I need to pay attention to. Now, what about those sneaky little things that can secretly slow down a website? I'm talking about those third-party scripts.
Ah, yes, third-party scripts, those seemingly harmless bits of code that allow you to embed social media feeds, add analytics tracking, and integrate other external services into your website.
Yeah, I use a bunch of those. They're super convenient for adding functionality, but I have a feeling you're going to tell me they're not so great for speed.
Well, it's a bit of a trade-off. While these scripts can add value to your website, each one also requires an extra request from your server to fetch the necessary data. And as we discussed earlier, those requests can add up and slow down your site's loading time.
So it's like having a party at your house, and each guest brings a dish to share. The more guests you have, the more food you have. But it also takes longer to prepare and serve everything.
That's a perfect analogy. And just like with a party, it's important to be mindful of how many third-party scripts you're inviting to your website and whether they're truly essential.
So what are some common culprits we should be looking out for? What are some examples of third-party scripts that are known to be speed hogs?
Social media embeds are a big one. Every time you embed a tweet or a Facebook post, your website has to connect to those platforms to grab the content. And if you have multiple embeds on a single page, those requests can really add up.
Okay, that makes sense. So it's not about banning all social media embeds, but maybe being more strategic about which ones we use and how many we include on each page.
Exactly. And the same goes for things like external comment systems, fancy font libraries, and those ubiquitous cookie consent pop-ups. Each one adds a little bit of weight to your website. It can contribute to slower loading times.
It's like those extra pounds we put on during the holidays.
Yeah.
They might seem insignificant individually, but they can collectively make a big difference.
Speaking of things that can add weight to your website, let's talk about plugins, those magical bits of software that extend the functionality of your website.
Ah, plugins. The lifeblood of any WordPress website. I love how they allow us to add all sorts of cool features and customization.
They're incredibly powerful tools, but they can also be a source of performance issues if we're not careful.
Oh, no, not another double-edged sword. It seems like every website speed optimization tactic comes with a trade-off.
In a way, it does, but that's what makes website optimization such an interesting challenge. It's all about finding that sweet spot between functionality and performance.
So how do we manage our plugin addiction responsibly?
It starts with understanding that each plugin adds extra code to your website, which your server then has to process. The more plugins you have, the more work your server has to do, which can lead to slower loading times.
Okay, so I'm starting to see the connection. It's like having a bunch of apps running in the background on your phone. You can drain your battery and make your phone run slower.
Exactly. So just like we try to minimize the number of apps running on our phones, we need to be selective about the plugins we install on our websites.
So less is more when it comes to plugins.
Not necessarily. It's not just about the quantity of plugins, but also the quality. Some plugins are well-coded and optimized for speed, while others can be real resource hogs.
So how do we tell the good plugins from the bad? What should we be looking for?
That's a great question. I'd say the first step is to regularly audit your plugins. Ask yourself, do I really need all of these plugins? Are there any that I haven't used in months? Are there any that are outdated or no longer compatible with the latest version of WordPress?
So it's like spring cleaning for your website. Out with the old unnecessary plugins.
Exactly. And when you're considering installing a new plugin, do your research, read reviews, check the plugin's website for information about its performance, and see if there are any known issues or conflicts with other plugins.
Okay, so it's all about being informed and making strategic decisions
Okay.
about which plugins to use.
Now let's move on to a technique that can make a huge difference in speeding up your website. Caching.
Caching. I've heard this word thrown around a lot, but I'm not entirely sure I understand what it means.
Think of caching like having a pre-made meal instead of cooking from scratch every time someone comes over for dinner.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So imagine a visitor comes to your website. Their browser requests a page, and your server has to gather all the necessary information, the HTML, the CSS, the images, the scripts, and assemble it into a complete web page to send back to the visitor.
Okay, so far so good.
But with caching, your server creates a static version of that page, like a pre-cooked meal, and stores it in a special location called a cache.
So the next time someone requests that same page, the server doesn't have to do all that work again. It can just serve the pre-made version from the cache.
Exactly, and this can drastically reduce the amount of time it takes to load the page. It's like serving a microwaved meal, instead of having to prepare and cook everything from scratch every time.
That's brilliant. So caching is essentially like creating a shortcut for your server, allowing it to deliver pages much faster.
Precisely. It's one of the most effective ways to improve your website's speed and performance.
I'm starting to understand why everyone raves about caching. It seems like a no-brainer for any website owner.
It really is. And the great thing is, there are many different caching plugins available that can handle most of the technical aspects for you.
Plugins to the rescue once again. So we don't need to be coding wizards to implement caching.
Not at all. Most caching plugins are relatively user-friendly and come with documentation and tutorials to guide you through the setup process.
That's a relief. I was starting to feel a bit intimidated by all the technical jargon.
Don't worry, we'll break it down for you in plain English. Now let's shift gears and talk about a technology that can make your website feel like it's traveling at the speed of light. CDNs.
CDNs. Is that some kind of secret internet society?
Not quite. CDN stands for Content Delivery Network. It's a network of servers distributed across the globe that work together to deliver your website's content to visitors as quickly as possible, no matter where they are in the world.
So it's like having a network of many websites all over the world, each ready to serve content to visitors in their respective regions?
That's a great way to think about it. Instead of all your website's content being served from a single server in one location, a CDN distributes it across multiple servers in different geographical locations.
Okay, I'm starting to see the benefit. So if someone in, say, Australia visits my website, which is hosted on a server in the United States, the CDN will serve the content from a server in Australia, making the page load much faster.
Exactly. It's like having a local shop in every city, ensuring your customers always get the fastest service possible.
That's so smart. And are CDNs just for big companies with lots of international traffic?
Not at all. There are CDNs for all sizes and budgets. In fact, some CDNs even offer free plans, making them accessible to everyone.
That's fantastic news. I'm definitely going to look into CDNs.
Now let's talk about something we all love: images.
Images. They make our websites beautiful and engaging. But I have a feeling they can also be a bit of a speed bump.
You're absolutely right. Images are often the biggest culprit when it comes to slow loading times. They can be large files. And if you have a lot of images on a page, they can really weigh down your website.
So it's like carrying a heavy backpack full of rocks. We might like the look of the rocks, but they're making it harder for us to move quickly.
That's a great analogy. But here's the good news. We can optimize our images without sacrificing quality. It's like replacing those heavy rocks with feathers. They still look nice, but they're much lighter and easier to carry.
Okay, I'm all for shedding some digital weight. How do we optimize our images for speed?
There are a few key strategies. First, we need to choose the right image format. JPEGs are generally best for photographs, while PNGs are better suited for graphics and images with transparency.
Okay, so file format matters. What else?
Compression is key. We can reduce the file size of our images without sacrificing noticeable quality, using various compression techniques.
It's like squeezing the air out of a balloon without actually popping it.
Exactly. And there are online tools and image optimization plugins that can handle compression for you automatically, making it even easier to implement.
That's super convenient. So we've got the right file format and we're compressing our images. What else can we do?
We can resize our images appropriately. Often images are uploaded at a much larger resolution than they need to be displayed on the website.
Right, because my camera takes massive photos, but my website doesn't need to display them at their full glory.
Exactly. Resizing your images to the dimensions they'll actually be displayed at can significantly reduce file size and speed up your website.
It's like tailoring a suit to fit perfectly, instead of wearing one that's several sizes too big. And speaking of tailoring, let's talk about cropping.
Cropping is another great way to optimize your images. By cropping your images to focus on the most important areas, you can reduce file size and improve the visual impact of your website.
So it's not just about making images smaller, it's also about making them more effective. And we can probably do all this with plugins, right?
You got it. There are plenty of image optimization plugins available that can handle resizing, cropping, and compression automatically, making it super easy to optimize your images for speed.
Plugins are like the superheroes of website optimization. They swoop in and save the day.
They can be incredibly helpful, that's for sure. Now let's move on to another important aspect of website speed optimization: lazy loading.
Lazy loading. Doesn't that sound a bit, well, lazy?
It might sound that way, but it's actually a very clever technique for improving your website's perceived performance.
Okay, I'm all ears. Explain this lazy loading sorcery to me.
Think about it this way. When a visitor loads a web page, do they really need to see all the images on the page immediately?
Not necessarily. Especially if some of those images are further down the page.
Exactly. That's where lazy loading comes in. Instead of loading all the images on a page at once, lazy loading only loads the images that are visible in the visitor's viewport, the part of the page they can see on their screen.
So as the visitor scrolls down the page, the images below the fold only load when they become visible.
Precisely. This means the initial page load is much faster, because the browser only has to download the essential elements first. Then, as the visitor scrolls, the remaining images load progressively, creating a smoother and more enjoyable experience.
It's like magic. The images just appear as if by enchantment when I scroll down.
It's a great way to improve perceived performance
Yeah.
and make your website feel much snappier, even if the overall page size hasn't changed drastically.
So how do we implement lazy loading? Is it another plugin situation?
There are definitely plugins that can handle lazy loading for you, but some themes even have built-in lazy loading functionality.
So there are options for all levels of technical expertise.
Exactly. And remember, the goal of lazy loading is to optimize the user experience by making the page feel faster and more responsive.
It's all about finding that sweet spot between performance and user satisfaction. This has been incredibly insightful so far, but I'm starting to feel like we've only scratched the surface,
You're right, we've covered a lot of ground already, but we've still got plenty more to discuss.
which means it's time for a little break. We'll be back with part 2 of this deep dive, where we'll explore even more strategies for speeding up your website. Don't go anywhere.
Welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're continuing our journey to a faster, more efficient website.
And ready to dive back in? Before the break, we were talking about lazy loading and how it can magically make images appear as we scroll. It's amazing how something so seemingly small can have such a big impact on user experience.
Yeah, it's those little details that often make the biggest difference. And speaking of details, let's talk about something that many website owners don't even realize can affect speed. Fonts.
Fonts. Seriously, I always thought they were just about aesthetics.
Well, while fonts are definitely important for visual appeal, they can also be sneaky little speed culprits, especially custom fonts.
I have to admit, I love using custom fonts to give my website a unique look, but I never considered how they might impact loading times.
Think about it this way. Each custom font you use adds another file that your website needs to download, and these files can be surprisingly large, especially if you're using multiple font weights and styles.
So it's like adding extra luggage to your suitcase. It might look nice, but it can slow you down at the airport.
Exactly. So what can we do to optimize our fonts for speed without sacrificing style? Well, the simplest solution is to stick with web-safe fonts.
Web-safe fonts, what are those?
These are fonts that are pre-installed on most computers and mobile devices, so your website doesn't have to download them every time someone visits.
Ah, so it's like using ingredients you already have in your pantry, instead of running to the store every time you want to cook something.
Perfect analogy. Using web-safe fonts is the most efficient option in terms of speed. But if you really want to use custom fonts, there are ways to optimize them.
Okay, let's hear it. How can we have our custom fonts and fast loading times too?
One option is to host the font files locally on your own server instead of relying on a third-party provider.
So it's like bringing those fonts in-house, eliminating that extra trip to the font store.
Exactly. Another strategy is to be selective about the number of font variants you use. Do you really need bold, italic, and regular versions of the same font? Or can you achieve the desired look with fewer variations?
That's a good point. I'm guilty of going a little font crazy sometimes.
We've all been there.
Yeah.
And there's another technique called font subsetting, which allows you to load only the specific characters you need from a font file, rather than the entire font.
So it's like creating a custom-tailored font file that's lean and mean.
Exactly. And there are tools and plugins that can help you implement all of these font optimization strategies.
Plugins to the rescue yet again. It's amazing how they can simplify these seemingly complex tasks.
They really can be lifesavers. Now let's shift gears and talk about something that often feels a bit intimidating, but is crucial to understanding website speed. HTTP requests.
HTTP requests. I have to admit, that sounds a bit technical for me.
Don't worry, I'll explain it in a way that makes sense. Think of an HTTP request as a message that your browser sends to a server when it needs to fetch something from your website. It could be an image, a script, a style sheet, or any other type of file.
Okay, so every time my browser needs to load something, it sends one of these HTTP requests to the server.
Exactly. And the more HTTP requests your website makes, the longer it takes to load. It's like having a long line at the grocery store checkout. The more people in front of you, the longer you have to wait.
So the goal is to minimize the number of HTTP requests our website makes.
Precisely. And in the past, one of the main strategies for reducing HTTP requests was to combine files. For example, you would merge all your CSS files into one big file, and all your JavaScript files into another.
That makes sense. Fewer files, fewer requests.
Right. But with the introduction of a newer technology called HTTP2, which most websites use now, combining files isn't as crucial as it once was.
So is combining HTTP requests completely unnecessary now?
Not necessarily. It can still have some benefits in certain scenarios, but it's no longer the be-all and end-all of website speed optimization. HTTP2 is like having multiple checkout lanes at the grocery store. Even if there are a lot of people in line, things move much faster because everyone isn't stuck in a single queue.
That's a helpful analogy. So HTTP2 has essentially made the website loading process more efficient.
Exactly. And this is a great example of how website speed optimization is an ever-evolving field. We need to stay up to date with the latest technologies and best practices to ensure our websites are performing at their best.
It sounds like there's always something new to learn.
There certainly is. Now let's move on to some optimization strategies. That might seem small individually, but they can add up to a noticeable improvement in your website's speed.
I'm all about those small wins that lead to big results.
Let's start with gzip compression.
gzip compression. What is that?
Imagine you're packing a suitcase for a trip. You want to fit as much as possible into your suitcase, so you start rolling up your clothes and squeezing the air out of them. That's essentially what gzip compression does to your website's files. It shrinks them down in size, making them faster to download.
So it's like zipping up a file on your computer. It makes the files smaller and easier to send or store.
Exactly. And the best part is most hosting providers enable gzip compression by default. If not, it's usually just a simple setting you can turn on in your hosting control panel.
Okay, that's a pretty easy win. What else can we do?
Another low-effort, high-reward optimization is minification.
Minification. That sounds intriguing.
Think of your website's code like a messy room full of clutter. Minification is like tidying up that room by removing all the unnecessary spaces, line breaks, and comments from your HTML, CSS, and JavaScript files.
So it's like decluttering the code to make it more streamlined. But wouldn't that make it harder for humans to read the code if they need to make changes?
That's a good point. Minified code can be a bit harder to read for humans. But browsers don't care about those extra spaces and comments. They just want the essential information.
So it's like using shorthand notes that only the computer understands.
Exactly. And there are plenty of tools and plugins that can handle minification for you automatically, so you don't have to do it manually.
Plugins to the rescue again.
Now let's talk about something that might seem a bit spring cleaning-esque: cleaning your website's database.
My website has a database.
Every WordPress website does. It's where all your content, settings, and user data are stored. And just like a real-world database, it can accumulate clutter over time.
What kind of clutter are we talking about?
Things like spam comments, old revisions of your posts and pages, trashed posts and leftover data from plugins you've deactivated or uninstalled.
So it's like digital hoarding. We're clinging onto all these digital scraps that we don't really need anymore.
Exactly. And all this clutter can actually slow down your website. It's like trying to find a specific book in a library that's overflowing with books. It just takes longer to search through all the mess.
Okay, I'm convinced. I need to declutter my website's database. How do I do that?
There are a few ways. You can do it manually through your hosting control panel. But the easiest way is to use a database cleaning plugin.
Plugins, plugins, plugins. I'm starting to think they're the secret to a happy and efficient website.
They can certainly be helpful. Now let's move on to another often overlooked optimization: removing query strings.
Query strings, what are those?
They're those little bits of text you sometimes see at the end of file URLs, like style.css.ver 1.2.3. They're used to tell the browser which version of a file to load, which is helpful for caching.
So they're like little labels that help the browser keep track of things.
Exactly. But the problem is some CDNs can't cache files with query strings, which can negate the benefits of using a CDN in the first place.
So removing query strings can potentially make our website load faster, especially if we're using a CDN.
Exactly. And just like with most other optimizations, there are plugins that can help you remove query strings automatically.
Plugins are like magic wands for website optimization. They can do practically anything.
Now let's talk about a few final tweaks we can make to streamline our WordPress installation.
Streamline our WordPress installation. What do you mean by that?
Well, WordPress comes with a bunch of features enabled by default that not everyone needs. By disabling these unnecessary features, we can slightly improve our website's performance.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What kind of features are we talking about?
For example, there's a feature called XML RPC, which allows external applications to communicate with your website.
So it's like a bridge that connects your website to other services.
Exactly. But if you're not using any external applications that require XML-RPC, you can safely disable it.
Okay, that makes sense. What else can we disable?
We can also disable things like the Wallow Manifest link for Windows Live Writer, the RSD link for really simple discovery, and WordPress short links if we're not using those features.
It's like decluttering our website's code.
Yeah.
And getting rid of unnecessary baggage.
Exactly. We can also disable emojis, embeds, and locally hosted gravitars if we're not using them.
I have to admit, I didn't even know my website had half of these features.
It's surprising how much stuff is going on behind the scenes of a WordPress website. And while disabling these features might not have a huge impact individually, they can collectively contribute to a slightly leaner and faster website.
It's all about those marginal gains, right?
Absolutely. And finally, we should regularly audit our WordPress themes.
Themes? I thought we were talking about plugins.
While themes don't usually have as big of an impact on speed as plugins, they can still contribute to bloat if they're poorly coded or include lots of unnecessary JavaScript.
So choosing a well-optimized theme is a good starting point for website speed optimization.
Absolutely. Look for themes that are lightweight, fast loading, and don't come with a ton of bells and whistles that you don't actually need.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. I'm starting to feel a bit overwhelmed by all the information,
That's understandable. We've thrown a lot at you today.
but it's been incredibly helpful.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see how website speed optimization is like a puzzle. There are all these different pieces we need to fit together to create a smooth and efficient experience for our visitors.
That's a great way to think about it. And we've still got one more piece of the puzzle to discuss.
Which means it's time for another break. But don't worry, we'll be back soon to wrap things up and leave you with some final thoughts and insights. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We're in the final stretch of our website speed optimization journey.
And we've saved some of the most powerful techniques for last.
We have.
I'm excited to hear what other tricks we have up our sleeves to make our websites lightning fast.
Let's start by revisiting a topic we touched on earlier, image optimization.
Ah, yes. Images. Those beautiful, engaging, and often website-slowing culprits.
They're a classic example of a double-edged sword. We love them for their visual appeal, but they can also be a major drag on performance if we're not careful.
It's like trying to run a marathon with a backpack full of bricks. You might look stylish, but you're not going to win any races.
Exactly. So how do we optimize our images for speed without sacrificing quality? It all starts with understanding that image optimization is a balancing act.
Balancing act. What do you mean by that?
We want to find that sweet spot between image quality and file size. We want our images to look sharp and professional, but we also want them to load quickly and not bog down our website.
So it's about finding the right compromise. We don't want to sacrifice quality for speed, but we also don't want our images to be so large that they take forever to load.
Exactly. And there are a few key strategies we can use to achieve this balance. First and foremost, we need to choose the right image format.
Okay, so file format matters. But how do we know which format is best for which type of image?
That's a great question. JPEGs are generally the best choice for photographs and images with lots of colors and details. They offer a good balance between quality and file size.
What about PNGs? Which we use those.
PNGs are better suited for graphics, logos, and images with transparency. They tend to produce higher quality images than JPEGs, but they also tend to have larger file sizes.
So it's about choosing the right tool for the job. JPEGs for photos, PNGs for graphics, and transparent images.
Exactly. Now, once we've chosen the appropriate file format, the next step is compression.
Compression, I've heard that word before, but I'm not entirely sure what it means in the context of images.
Think of it like squeezing the air out of a balloon without actually popping it. We're removing unnecessary data from the image file without compromising the visible quality of the image.
So it's like making the image file smaller without making the image itself look any different.
Precisely. And there are various compression techniques and algorithms that can achieve this. Some are lossy, meaning they sacrifice some image data to achieve a smaller file size, while others are lossless, meaning they preserve all the image data while still reducing the file size.
That's fascinating. It's like magic, but for images.
And the great thing is we don't have to be coding wizards to implement compression. There are plenty of online tools and plugins that can handle it for us automatically.
Plugins to the rescue again.
Yeah.
They really are the unsung heroes of website speed optimization.
They certainly make our lives easier. Now let's talk about another important aspect of image optimization, resizing.
Resizing. Isn't that just about making images bigger or smaller?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. Often images are uploaded to websites at a much larger resolution than they need to be displayed at. This means the browser has to download a much larger file than necessary, which slows down the page loading time.
So it's like wearing a suit that's several sizes too big. It might look impressive, but it's going to be uncomfortable and restrict your movement.
That's a great analogy. By resizing our images to the exact dimensions they'll be displayed at on our website, we can significantly reduce file size without sacrificing visible quality.
It's like tailoring our images to fit perfectly on our website. No more oversized image files weighing us down.
Now, speaking of tailoring, let's talk about cropping.
Cropping. I usually use that to remove unwanted elements from my photos.
Exactly. And it can also be a valuable tool for image optimization. By cropping our images to focus on the most important areas, we can further reduce file size and improve the visual impact of our website.
So it's not just about making images smaller, it's also about making them more effective.
Precisely. By carefully considering the composition and focal point of our images, we can crop them to eliminate unnecessary visual clutter and create a more streamlined and engaging user experience.
I love how image optimization is about so much more than just making files smaller. It's about enhancing the overall user experience.
Absolutely. And we can take this concept of enhancing user experience even further with a technique we discussed earlier, lazy loading.
Lazy loading. Remind me again how that works.
Lazy loading is all about delaying the loading of non-critical resources, like images, until they're actually needed. This means the initial page load is much faster, because the browser only has to download the essential elements first. Then, as the visitor scrolls down the page, the remaining images load progressively.
So it's like only turning on the lights in the rooms you're actually using. No need to illuminate the entire house if you're just hanging out in the living room.
Exactly. And lazy loading is particularly beneficial for pages with lots of images or videos, as it can significantly reduce the initial page weight and improve perceived performance.
It's like giving your website a performance boost without actually changing the content itself.
Precisely. And as we've discussed before, there are plugins and even some themes that can handle lazy loading for you automatically.
Plugins really are the gift that keeps on giving.
They certainly make our lives easier. Now, before we wrap things up, let's circle back to one final element that can impact website speed: themes.
Themes. I thought we covered that earlier when we were talking about choosing a lightweight and well-coded theme.
We did touch on it briefly, but it's worth reiterating, because your choice of theme can have a ripple effect on your website's performance.
Okay.
Even if you choose a theme that's marketed as fast loading or optimized for speed, it's essential to regularly audit your theme and ensure it's not contributing to any unnecessary bloat.
Bloat. What kind of bloat are we talking about?
It could be anything from excessive JavaScript files to bulky CSS style sheets to poorly optimized images embedded within the theme itself.
So it's like buying a new car that's advertised as fuel efficient, but then you start loading it up with unnecessary cargo, which weighs it down and reduces its mileage.
That's a great way to put it. So just like we regularly declutter our homes and our computers, it's important to declutter our websites and ensure our themes are as lean and efficient as possible.
This has been an incredibly insightful deep dive into the world of website